Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Angus McLachlan and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Liberate Medical. We develop breakthrough respiratory muscle stimulation devices to help patients take their next breath. And today I'm delighted to tell you about our lead program, the Vent-Free Respiratory Muscle Stimulator, and how it can help patients wean more successfully from mechanical ventilation. So mechanical ventilation is, of course, life-saving, but is associated with numerous secondary complications. These include long periods of ventilation have a number of secondary complications. These include hospital-acquired infections, very high rates of mortality, both in the hospital as well as after discharge, and then severely reduced quality of life that can persist for months or even years after that patient's discharge from the hospital. It's also expensive to look after these patients. Patients requiring more than 7 days on the ventilator typically cost more than double those patients that spend less than 7 days. And in aggregate, long-term ventilation patients cost the US healthcare system more than $30 billion per year. So a major factor leading to these patients having difficulty coming off the ventilator is weakness of the respiratory muscle pump. And a critical component of that is weakness of the expiratory muscles. And we know that these muscles start to atrophy or weaken within hours of that patient going onto the ventilator, and that atrophy progresses very quickly during those first 5 days of ventilation support. Now, this puts patients in a situation where the underlying condition that put them on the ventilator has been treated, but now essentially they're too weak to be extubated, and so they go through this period of weaning from the ventilator. Ideally, we think what you want is an intervention that can be used from the start of mechanical ventilation as a way of preventing that muscle atrophy from happening in the first place, and that's exactly what we're doing with our device. So the Vent-Free stimulator applies non-invasive transcutaneous electrical muscle stimulation to the abdominal wall muscles. These are your major expiratory muscle. And then we have an airflow sensor so that we can synchronize that stimulation with the breathing pattern of the ventilator. This allows the therapy to start within days of that patient being placed onto the ventilator, and the stimulation causes those muscles to contract, exercises the muscles, and prevents that atrophy from happening in the first place. And by doing this, we've seen fantastic clinical outcomes in the 2 pilot randomized controlled trials that we've done to date. Across these trials, we had 40 patients, 20 in the control and 20 in the treatment arm. And as you can see from the slide, we saw significantly more patients were successfully extubated from the ventilator, and that time to extubation was about 2 days shorter in the treatment group versus control. And similarly, for the ICU length of stay, we had more patients successfully discharged, and that time to ICU discharge was about 4 days shorter in the treatment group versus control. There's no doubt that getting a patient off the ventilator is better for the patient outcomes. However, it can also drive significant value for the hospital. Most of these patients are reimbursed under the DRG system, which is a fixed amount of money based on that patient's diagnosis. And we know that the last day of ICU care is associated with the cost of around $1,500 per day. So that's the amount of money you can save by reducing days in the ICU. And this really gives us 3 value propositions to the hospital. First and foremost is improving those patient outcomes. Second of all, it's potentially reducing cost in a significant way for each patient treated. Or if you have an ICU with very high occupancy rates, something that's happened a lot over the last year, you can potentially increase ICU throughput and increase revenue by increasing the number of patients that are treated. This space of preventing atrophy in ventilated patients has got a lot of attention over the last couple of years, and there are a number of technologies in development. All of the alternative technologies out there are forms of temporary diaphragm pacing. So they're targeting the diaphragm muscle, which is your main inspiratory muscle. We're the only company targeting the expiratory muscles, which we think are a critical part of this. Other differentiators include the fact that we are non-invasive, whereas all these other technologies are invasive. And that not only means the technology is more safe, but it means it's easier to apply. It can be applied by a nurse or a respiratory therapist versus a doctor. And it also allows us to go straight to this opportunity of preventing the muscle atrophy, which is a pretty wide proportion of the total ventilation population. In comparison, the first generation of these diaphragm pacing systems are really being used more as a rescue therapy in patients that have failed to wean from the ventilator. So the revenue model is fairly straightforward. We have a reusable device which will be placed at no charge into hospitals. And then we have the per-patient consumables, which also have to be replaced every 5 days of treatment. And even at low quantities, we have gross margins in excess of 80% for those. Looking at the market opportunity, there are around 7.5 million patients that go on to invasive ventilation every year worldwide. Of these, about 2.25 million will be difficult to wean from the ventilator and suitable for the vent-free therapy. And then looking at Europe and the US, which is where we're initially focused, there are about 1.3 million patients that could benefit from our technology, and this gives us a serviceable addressable market of more than $1.5 billion per year. So that's just for invasive ventilation. Our vision for the technology expands beyond that. Because it's non-invasive, it does give us this opportunity to continue using the therapy once that patient's discharged home. And so we can use it to help recover after hospital discharge. And then that's really a stepping stone to more chronic use of the technology where we can assist patients breathing in the long term. Our team includes myself. I did my PhD research in this technology and co-founded the company after finishing my doctoral research. Guillermo Cohen is our VP of Engineering, has been in the medical device industry for his career and taken several devices from concept through FDA onto the market. Torsten Weilerschek leads up our commercial operations in Europe, again, very experienced in the medical device industry, working with some of the larger companies in this space, such as Draeger. And then last but not least, Mindy Ditch is leading our clinical operations, again, with significant experience in the medical device industry, doing clinical trials. Just taking a quick look at our milestones and then what's next for the company. So we do have our key patents covered with granted patents covered in the US as well as outside of the US, and then additional patents pending. We have the CE mark for the device. The device has been transferred to manufacturing and being produced. In the US, we have the breakthrough device designation from the FDA, as well as the emergency use authorization that we got for the COVID-19 pandemic. And then looking forward, our next big objective is to complete the pivotal clinical trial of the technology, and that's going to be used to support FDA de novo clearance, as well as gain clinical adoption and clinical acceptance. In parallel to that, we do plan to run a limited market release in select European markets to gather additional data and real-world experience. And then finally, we'll do the initial proof of concept testing for our Recover and Assist programs in the home. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen. We'd love to talk to you more about what we're doing and look forward to speaking afterwards. Thanks a lot.